Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. If new people join, they can catch it as we're going, but there's a lot to cover, so I want to make sure we get to it. As you all know, as the folks on the call know, I'm Andy Ellis. I'm the Secretary of the Maryland Green Party, and tonight we're going to be covering in a webinar format marijuana policy in Maryland and the Green Party position on it. We have Lawrence Grandpre, who's the Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and author of the Community Restoration Fund, a policy roadmap to reparations for the war on weed. And he's going to talk about the groundwork for a reparative marijuana policy in Maryland coming up, and how we balance racial and social justice with the inevitable, I think at this point, legalization of recreational cannabis in Maryland. So a couple of housekeeping things. I'm going to keep everybody on mute. If there's questions, go ahead and type them into the chat. Lawrence is going to present for a while, and then we'll have a robust discussion after that. And then we don't seem to have anybody on the phone. I did figure out the Zoom phone codes, so in the future we'll use those. But I guess I want to lay the groundwork real quick and say that we're in a unique opportunity in Maryland to have a legalization of cannabis policy that is really in line with the Green Party values. The Green Party has long called for legalization of recreational cannabis and has called for a policy generally of reparations for past wrongs and for the wrongs of slavery and the ongoing injustices of racial injustice in America. So Lawrence has a position that takes the idea of reparations beyond simply repairing those who are hurt by being placed out of the drug market or who are specifically within that market, and brings it to a much broader perspective. This is not the policy of the Green Party, but I think Lawrence has a policy that is good, and we as the Green Party need to, over the next year, decide whether we're going to endorse it or not. But I think that it's a great policy framework that he has in order to use the recreational legalization of marijuana as a reparation for the war on weed and the war on drugs. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lawrence Grandpre, Director of Research from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle.
All right, thanks, Andy, and thanks for all the folks who were able to hop on the webinar. So I'm going to break this down roughly into 3 parts. I'm hoping each part takes no more than 10 minutes. First, I kind of just want to give some backstory to the harm caused by marijuana prohibition, kind of within the context of the framework I'm using. Second, I want to describe what I see as the 3 pillars, the 3-legged stool of marijuana equity, with a focus on the 3rd leg of the stool, where LBS is trying to focus in terms of community reinvestment. And third, I want to focus on where we are in Maryland right now and what the landscape is going forward. So as I think many people on this webinar probably know, the war on drugs have had a disproportionate impact on people of color. The American Civil Liberties Union did a report in, I believe, 2011 and 2012, basically like the war on marijuana in black and white. It basically says that though black people and white people use weed and sell weed at equal rates, additionally, statistics say you likely buy your drugs from a person who looks like you. So black folks and white folks are selling and using weed at equal rates. In Maryland, you are 5.6 times more likely to be charged with a marijuana-related crime if you were black. And this varies from locality to locality. In some parts of the state, it's a higher ratio of white to black arrest rates than that. But in addition to that, much of the work that I cite in the piece I wrote and the intellectual framework I use is basically saying that when you have mass incarceration targeted to very specific zip codes and neighborhoods, you basically hollow out the community and you produce the conditions where the institutions you need to give people a better life, to give them alternatives to the street economy, the construction of those very institutions are undermined by mass incarceration. Because the people you need to produce those institutions and the people you need to service those institutions are taken out of the community. So one of the people who I use to sort of express this theory is Todd Clear, who has a book. He's a professor at Rutgers in New Jersey. He has a book called Imprisoning Community, where he basically says it is literally mass incarceration which is driving our crime epidemic. And part of the reason that's happening is that when you incarcerate, target mass incarceration in particular zip codes and neighborhoods, you are so hollowing out civil society. You are hollowing out the informal community social networks that people need to like live and survive, that you're creating conditions where people have no alternative to the underground economy. And similarly, and this is very, very important, this has implications for people who are not selling drugs. So when you have communities targeted with mass incarceration, one thing I cite in the piece is that while, as we know, we should question all federal drug laws and think about liberalizing and or legalizing all of these drugs, a disproportionate percentage of the arrests in the 90s, starting in the 90s, was really focused on weed. So when we talk about one of the biggest drivers of prison population growth in the 90s especially, the war on drugs in terms of pure arrest rates was largely a war on weed. So we have entire communities being impacted, but that ripples out to the families of the people arrested, the girlfriends and the wives and boyfriends of the people arrested. You have to like move because you can't afford rent anymore, or you're in public housing and now you have a drug record. That is chopping. I really want people to think of these social ties as a network and really understand that mass incarceration is chopping up those social ties. So if you have to move to a new school, studies show that independent of pedagogy, independent of anything else, literally having moved to a new school is the number one risk factor for someone dropping out of school. Largely because they are so cut off from the existing social fabric they need to matriculate through school. And then maybe, being teased as a new person and things like that. He calls this coercive mobility. I don't love that term, but he's trying to express that this entire community is being forcibly disrupted. So that's part of the big reason why when I think about reparations for war on drugs, I don't want to focus specifically or only on the individual who goes to jail. Because in our liberal individualist society, it's very easy for people to think about individuals. So much of the conversation about marijuana reparations is focused on individuals who sold weed in the underground economy, them individually getting expungements, them individually getting their records annulled, and them individually getting access to the industry, economic opportunity. I'm not against any of that. I do believe that when it comes to reparations, we have to have a more communal, holistic, community-focused framework. That's why I call it community restoration, because even if you're not selling weed in these communities, the fact that your community was targeted for hyper-incarceration really impacts your life chances, because the civil society fabric, the youth groups, the nonprofits, the church groups, all these things that are the cornerstones of communities are decimated when you have targeted hyper-incarceration. So if you want to have a policy that begins to restore the harms of the war on drugs, you need to have a policy that explicitly targets how do we rebuild the social fabric in these communities that are targeted by hyper-incarceration in a way that is driven by the people who actually are in those communities, the people who experience the war on drugs, the people who need to have the autonomy and funding to develop civil society institutions that reflect their culture and reflect their needs. So how do we do that? So that gets me to the second part of the talk. I see equitable marijuana policy is a three-legged stool. And if you ever try to sit on this two-legged stool, you realize you have a problem. So the goal is to really have all three legs of the stool as strong as possible. Along those lines, that basically means, in my mind, marijuana policy is almost three separate fights rolled into one. So you need three separate, in my mind at least, strategies, coalitions, and theories for each different part of the process. Now, I'm really only going to focus on one today, but I want people to hear my thinking about the other two legs of the stool so they can have a comprehensive vision of what I think marijuana justice might look like. So the first leg of the stool is expungement resentencing for people who have gone through the criminal justice process. So we know that in these neighborhoods, you're looking at individuals who may be arrested multiple times for low-level drug offenses, and they have these criminal records that follow them around for the rest of their lives, impacting their employment, impacting their housing, and things like that. So not only, fundamentally, it's not fair for these people to have a scarlet letter for the rest of their lives doing what the state is now going to deem is completely legal and or desirable for rich white people to do, which is sell weed. That's just wrong. So you need to have a mechanism built into the law, which is currently in terms of language, in the bills that are being presented. I'll talk about that at the end. That basically not only says that these sort of possession with intent to distribute charges should be eligible for expungement, as should possession charges be, but it should be, we should develop an infrastructure and fund the infrastructure to make that automatic. Because even going through the process of paying for an expungement or just knowing you have to go in and check in to get your record expunged is very difficult for a lot of people. And Washington has actually done a pilot program where they've actually shown that this is possible and productive. So automatic expungement of these records. And if you're currently in jail for one of these charges, obviously you should have the ability to appeal your sentence and get out of jail, have your sentence commuted to time served or something along those lines. Now, that's its own thing. That's an entirely big fight. So we need to look at the folks who are doing expungement, folks like Out for Justice, folks like JOTF, and other grassroots community entities that have expertise there to lead on that fight. I think to some extent that's been happening. The second leg of the stool is the industry. This is the most complicated part of it because I've been going to conferences and talking to people in the marijuana industry for a year. I don't have experience with the industry. I'm not a recreational marijuana consumer. So I've been trying to learn about the industry as much as possible. What I've learned is that it is just very, very difficult to make money in this game. You need about $2 to $3 million to start a dispensary, for example. We could do everything right in the law, write every provision correctly to give preferential treatment to Black and brown people who have criminal records, and they would still need $2 to $3 to $4 million to run a profitable dispensary. I am not saying we shouldn't do priority for minorities so they could have recreational dispensaries. I'm saying those who are truly interested in seeing this economic opportunity as something that can build community should have great ingenuity, creativity, and a realistic focus about how hard it is to make money in this game. Because that's the biggest thing I've realized, that you got multi-billion-dollar industries coming into this space, pushing out all small-scale entrepreneurs, white or Black. And some of my frustration has been, this is where people want to go when they think of equity. Equity is you were selling on the corner, now you own your own shop. So we need to, in my mind, reframe what equity and reparation looks like, because it is very, very difficult to write policy that actually encourages minority entrepreneurship in the sector. You gotta look at things like transport, delivery, running the security systems, and small-scale cottage industries for small-scale producers. All those things should be prioritized in a good legalization bill. None of them are panaceas, and none of them are reparations. So what does reparations look like? Leads of Beautiful Struggle has experienced, with not one, but really two, grassroots grant-making efforts. We had one called B-City. It's on the west side of Baltimore, run by the health department. It's a small grant, roughly $1 million per grant pool. And basically, LBS was brought in, specifically our Director of Public Policy, Dave Long Love, to construct a grant-making system that was run by the people of West Baltimore. This was not very popular with the nonprofit institutions powers that be, but it got constructed, the grants went out, that was generally a good experience. LBS then went on to help construct the Baltimore City Youth Fund. Again, we had to push back against established interests who basically had already claimed that money as their own. And we went through a 1.5 year process of fighting to get the money established in a place where there was an understanding that there was community accountability in the fund. Going through a process, we helped recruit individuals who were basically paid to replace traditional program officers at foundations. So it was the community, people who were paid to evaluate and rank applications for the Baltimore City Youth Fund, and that money just went down a few months ago. So while none of these processes are perfect, they to me fundamentally represent a shift in power to the community. And that's one of the critical sine qua non requirements of what reparations has to be. Because people will ask you the question, well, what are they going to pay for? What's this money going to go towards? And one of the things I want to counter with is, you asking me that question is understandable, but you have to understand, if I tell you what it's going to go towards, that is the exact opposite of the intent of what the bill should be. The bill should empower people in community to make decisions for themselves what they want to give money to. And that's the scariest thing for a politician. The scariest thing for a politician is to construct a process that they do not have control over. That's what makes this fight so difficult. It's not that this is a hard sell, that we need to give money to communities impacted by war and drugs. That's relatively easy. I don't doubt that we can do that. What is going to be the hard part of this fight is building a political process that builds into the structure of how the grant making decisions go out, who holds the money, and all these different levels, a process that is driven by community that politicians cannot co-opt and control. That's the hard part. That's the part LDS has worked on the ground for 4 or 5 years, building real life functioning grant making institutions that fundamentally put power in the hands of the community. So I don't have, the question about what that looks like is an open question. There is no panacea that solves that conundrum. But here are some of the things that LBS has looked towards. First, you have to divide with the question of who holds the money. So that should be held up to community through the mechanism that we have right now, which is imperfect, but is there. Localities such as Prince George's County, Baltimore City, should have to pass an ordinance which designates who they want to hold the money. That gives grassroots activists a point of entry into the process. What you're looking for is points of entry for the community to have meaningful control over this money, and that's one. So in Baltimore City, we have the Family League. Family League is our designated fiscal management board. That is the entity that is designated to receive funds from like the federal government, the state government, things like that. Some Family League has a lot of good people that work there, but it as an institution has a track record a lot of people have questioned. And part of our advocacy around the youth fund was we don't want that money in the Family League. So these are the types of questions that you can then ask and answer as a community if the state bill was written in a way that allowed for the locality to designate who controlled the money. So that's one of the big differences that I see in this bill as compared to other bills in other states. In California, there is a provision in their legalization fund where they have a fund where they're supposed to build economic opportunity in neighborhoods impacted by the war on drugs. Now, that is entirely done through the governor's office in California. I don't think that's a good model. If you like your governor, maybe that's good. I know a lot of people have questions about this governor, but in general, you want to have the money as close to the people as possible, as close to localities as possible. So you want the money to go to a designated an entity designated by ordinance by localities. And obviously, you want that money proportionally levied out based upon demonstrable impacts of the war on drugs in these different localities. So the metric by which you do that, up for discussion. I think a simple one would be look how much money it takes to incarcerate people from said locality, and then have that be a critical factor in terms of how much money that locality would get from this fund. So without saying the word black, without saying the word race, you are looking at the history of Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and PG County, and they're going to be disproportionately engaged by this fund. But you also got to think about people being arrested for things like opioid-related offenses in Western Maryland and the Eastern Shore. So this framework is inclusive of the diversity of impacts that folks could have with the war on drugs. You don't have to limit it to marijuana-related offenses. But you are allowing the history of race and racism to do the work for you, writing, in this case, essentially colorblind legislation that will have a color-conscious impact in terms of how it is implemented. Now, there's another layer to that, which is a little bit more difficult, but I think really interesting and important. So along these lines of having the bill serve its intended effects and not get as co-opted as it could be, can't completely prevent it. How do you make sure the right people get the money? One of the things I'd like to see is what I'm calling a retroactive residency preference in essentially the RFP, the request for proposal that the different localities present. So with a retroactive residency preference, you look at request for money that comes into whatever the entity holding this money is. Additionally, I think that this fund should not be limited to nonprofit social service programming. It should also include the possibility of investing in community economic development ventures. So I think that's a hard thing to do. I think that's ideally something you want to plan for, is that it's not limited to charity. It's given Black and brown entrepreneurs, not in the marijuana sector, and that's a critical fact, because many of these communities, there are people who never sold weed, but they want money to do their own thing because their communities have been devastated by the war on drugs, even though they never went to jail. So you want to have economic investment and social service investment for people who have lived in these communities, but don't just live there now. You want to prefer people that lived there in the 90s and early 2000s, when the implementation of war on drugs policing was at its highest. That does two things. And this is what I'll end on before I transition to where we are today. That would do two things that are important. First, it would account for the possibility of gentrification in some of these neighborhoods. So as opposed to preferring the people who are there now, think about PG County, a retroactive residency preference would look at the people who lived in these neighborhoods during the highest war on drugs enforcement. So that would allow people who specifically have experience in these neighborhoods, but there's still probably a high arrest rate, because gentrifying neighborhoods can have a high arrest rate as part of gentrification. But you have people who have the longitudinal history of experience with this neighborhood, to have seen the changes and be able to see the types of programming that could actually help people who've lived in those neighborhoods for decades, the people who may be excluded from traditional social services, traditional economic opportunities. You would also account for the possibility of white and black and brown people who do not live in these neighborhoods trying to come in and say, I know what's best for this neighborhood. I have a sweet proposal to save this neighborhood. You can't stop that. You especially can't stop them by writing the proposal, but you can produce provisions in terms of the types of proposals you prefer that recognizes we don't want more black and brown or white saviors trying to come in and save these neighborhoods. There are people with indigenous talents in these neighborhoods that we want to invest in. And I think, again, the U Fund, if you just look at the list of people we funded with the U Fund, you have a program called Revolutionary Summer, which is a literacy program for black girls in Baltimore. You have programs that do African-centered graphic design and videography. You have a bevy of programs that traditionally do not get funded by large white philanthropic entities. And those are the type of programs that would be preferred by this framework, because they come from people who have a longitudinal experience in the neighborhoods that have been impacted by the war on drugs. Similarly, LBS is working on economic development in some of these neighborhoods. We're working with an attempt to produce a black arts district in the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor. This is a prime neighborhood that would be very high on the list of neighborhoods for investment from this fund. That is also lots of economic opportunities there in terms of housing, in terms of existing indigenous arts-based entities and artists who live there who just never get investment. So that's why I think it's important to have the possibility of economic investment be part of the fund as well, which will make it different than the U Fund, which will require you to think a bit differently about how you build the infrastructure. But again, I think ideally that's what you would do. It's not exclusive of all the stuff you're going to hear in terms of where they want the money to go. It's not exclusive of drug treatment. It's not exclusive of after-school programming. It's only saying that we should target the neighborhoods that have been most impacted by the war on drugs with that programming. And the people themselves who live in those neighborhoods should choose what programming they want for their neighborhoods. So the people in these neighborhoods might not want a methadone clinic, but they may want a form of alternative treatment that focuses on a more holistic methodology towards addiction that tries to reintegrate people with addiction into community. And actually, it's exactly some of the feedback we're getting when we canvass in these neighborhoods. They're saying we don't want methadone clinics because they just give them methadone and don't do anything for them. They're just getting money. So the community could tell you there are people in community that have developed alternative modes of treatment that might be more effective than the methadone clinic, but they can't get the funding to put their treatment strategies at scale. So these are the types of innovations and interesting options that are available to you when you have this pot of money going this way. Now, what does that mean? Where are we now? What's this pot of money? How big is it going to be? How are they going to get kicked out? Let's start to answer some of these questions, and I'll try to be brief. So there's a lot of pseudoscience around projecting how much money you're going to get from marijuana taxation. People just basically throw numbers around because they're round numbers and they're cool things to say. I know that Ben Jealous had a number that he threw out, which is around 350 million. I thought that number was completely ridiculous. And the governor's office, to their credit, came out and said, unless people in Maryland, all of them, smoke weed all day, we're not getting 350 million in tax revenue. I think that's true. Depending on where you set the tax, determines how much revenue you get, and determines how weed will function in the economy. So the higher you set the tax, the more expensive weed is. You get lower weed sales, but you get more tax money from each weed sale. But you also have less disruption of the existing underground economy. The weed's super expensive. You're going to have people buy more weed. Conversely, if the tax is set low, you get less money coming in per sale, but you have more sales total. But since the price of weed in the legal economy is low, you may have deeper disruption to the underground economy. And that's one of the biggest things that I'm worried about with legalization, is you're basically going to put a bunch of people out of business eventually. The price of legal weed starts off high, but it's going to come down over time. If we don't do something about community reinvestment, you're going to have a lot of people who are unemployed essentially. Which is why we need to have an accurate projection of how much money is going to come in, and we need to have an accurate projection of what we have to do to have conversations about how this money can go out in an equitable way. The best number I can give you is between 75 and 150 million per year when the industry is at full scale. Now, that's a really back of the napkin number, but I think it accommodates for the inherent variability of this fund. We do not know how much money is going to come in year to year. We don't know if it's going to be 150 million. Don't know if it's going to be 75. It is a question of where the state of Maryland chooses to set the tax. Right now, there's a bill that is almost certainly not going to pass in the Maryland State Legislature. It's called SB 0771. It sets the tax around 6%, which I think is probably a little bit low. But there are some science coming out, economic science, that says that many states are setting the tax too high. So I want to do some back of the napkin numbers, or maybe do some better than that back of the napkin numbers to figure out what that means for this fund. And what it does mean is that people are having conversations about what they want to do with this money. These conversations have not gotten very far. The head of the state Senate, you know him, Mike Miller, very powerful, says it's too early to start talking about where the tax money goes. I think that's a good sign, because it shows that this debate has not matured to the point where we can't influence it. And obviously, I think Mike Miller is wrong. We have to start talking about this question right now, because otherwise, other people are having this conversation behind closed doors. And again, there's no doubt a bevy of very, very valuable things this money can go to. You're going to hear a ton of people saying this should go directly to pay for Kerwin, the education reform. You're going to have people saying this should go to opioids. This should go to, you're going to have people say everything. And that's part of why we're having this conversation now, is to try to get ahead of the conversation a little bit and to begin to have a conversation about how we respond to these questions. For example, Kerwin. I think part of the problem of Baltimore City Public Schools right now is that they are being funded through a formula that is inherently variable. So as many of you probably know, it's this weird kabuki dance multiplier effect complex formula that takes into account property tax assessments in Baltimore and takes into account economic growth statistics in Baltimore, basically projecting how much Baltimore City should be able to pay for its own education. Problem, of course, being there is appreciation of property tax assessments in Baltimore City, but a lot of that appreciation is because Baltimore cuts deals with developers where they basically get to develop in Baltimore property tax free for a certain number of years. So the formula getting all goofed up because of all this weird, crazy math that's happening in terms of how this expected Baltimore City investment in schools is being projected. Given that, it makes no sense to me to try to solve the problem of funding schools in Maryland/Baltimore, which is that the formula is biased and variable, with a new formula that is also variable. So this is not the thing where you want to plug it into a vital service, because you cannot project how much money is going to be in that pot every year. No pun intended, right? So you're going to hit the same dance, the same song when it comes to universal pre-K. That was Ben Jealous's big thing, that he wanted to use money to pay for universal pre-K. Very laudable goal. Statistics say it works pretty well. Frees parents up to go to work, gives kids a head start. Very important, so important, in my opinion, it should be funded directly by the state of Maryland, and you shouldn't try to shoehorn the program into this relatively small pot of money. I think we should embrace the fact that this pot, you know, it's that weird part of life where you have to realize $100 million is not that much money in the grand scheme of things. But we're talking about a pot of money that isn't big for people like you and me, but in the grand scheme of Maryland's $30+ billion state budget isn't a fundamental game changer. It's just big enough that people get these really grandiose ideas of what it could do for them in their district, but it's small enough that the reality of the political impact of it is relatively small. So it's a winnable fight. It's a fight that we've made progress on. The current bill allocates 20% of state tax revenues into something that Senator Will Smith calls repairing the harm to the war on drugs. Now, what does that mean? The bill does not say, which lets you know that this battle is going to come to a hit in 2020 in the next session, because there's also been a work group established in the House and the Senate that is studying how Maryland can pursue recreational marijuana. In the House, it is run by Delegate Dumais. In the Senate, this working group, they have two separate working groups. In the Senate, this working group is run by none other than Bobby Durkin. So we are dealing with a Maryland the House of Delegates and Senate that's going to have conflicting visions about what this money should go to and how legalization should happen. But they are working out their answers to these questions right now. So this is a really important time to try to get advocates on the same page, or at least in the same chapter, in terms of what they're saying equitable good marijuana policy is. Because they're going to have to study this issue for really months and months to produce recommendations before next session, which are going to be the foundations of the bill, which is likely going to pass next session. And even when that bill passes next session, they're still going to have to implement the darn thing in 2021 after it goes to a vote in November of 2020, right? And the reason it's going to go to a vote now in here is that you could legalize it straight from the legislature. Vermont just did it. It did not go to a vote in Vermont. Legislature just did it. You could do that here in Maryland. But there are enough lawmakers who want to say, I didn't vote to legalize weed. I voted for the constituents to have a voice about legalizing weed, right? Because there is, a conservative streak in the state that is different than some other states where this has happened. There's a Black church-related conservatism. There is a Black bourgeoisie-related conservatism. There is just, one thing I say about this is that Maryland would be the first Southern state. If you embrace the reality that Maryland, in many ways, is a Southern state, Maryland will be the first Southern state to legalize recreational marijuana. So we're dealing with a diversity of concerns that lawmakers have, which is different than Oregon, different than Washington, different even than Massachusetts, right? So you're having some people have the traditional marijuana is a gateway drug, marijuana is the devil's grass, I don't want my kids near it. There is some of that, but you are having some, especially Black lawmakers, having the concerns about where's the benefit to my community. I see just white people coming in, just making money and taking it out of our community. And that's my concern about legalization. It's not that I think this is some conspiracy by the man to hurt Black people. I just want to know where the benefit is. And one thing that I want to be able to tell these lawmakers is that I agree with you. There is a big possibility that rich white people are going to sell your kids legal weed and become rich off of them. And you don't want that, and I don't want that. So we need to engage in advocacy, real conversations around what we're going to do, not only to pursue minority entrepreneurship, because that's where folks are trained to go. All these folks know is jobs. That's all they know. And all they know is that people getting rich off of this, I want my piece of the pie. So we have to expand their political framework to see this is a space for direct reinvestment in their neighborhoods, especially in economic opportunity that is not selling weed. Because there are, just think about conservative Black homeowners associations, conservative Black community groups who say, I don't know if I want a dispensary on my block, even if it is Black run. What I want to be able to tell them is that I understand your concerns. I think we should be realistic about this is not what you think it is, right? There's a lot of good science that talk about marijuana is no more harmful than drinking. People are going to smoke weed anyway, but the quality and the potency of what they get on the street, they have no idea of, right? So there's a really strong case to legalize marijuana from a public health perspective. But in addition to that, We need to be making the community perspective, which is, look, this money is going to get sucked out of your neighborhood anyway. It's either going to get sucked out in nickel and dimes by people who do it in the street economy, many of whom the people that grow their weed do not live here. Many of the people that sell in your neighborhood do not live here. There is an opportunity to get investment in your community for the thousands of people that you know that don't smoke weed and don't sell weed. But the only way they have a shot of getting any investment is if we advocate forcefully on this bill now. And I think that works for all communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs, to say, look, there's a real opportunity for us to engage in getting investment in communities that have been denied investment for decades, so that it's not just the people that know how to sell weed that are going to make money. It's the people that know how to braid hair. It's the people that know how to fix cars. It's the people that know how to do martial arts. The people that know how to fix dirt bikes. All these people in the community who need investment so they can have real opportunities in their lives, that live in communities that have been decimated by the war on drugs. This is an opportunity to invest in these neighborhoods. And the very last thing I'll say is that, well, I'm looking at $20-30 million realistically. Where's $20-30 million going to make its best impact? Is it going to make a big impact in universal pre-K? It's not. It's going to make a big impact in a $1 billion school budget? It's not. $20-30 million has a big impact in a particular poor zip code in West Baltimore in terms of deterring future costs to the state of incarcerating people from that zip code, in terms of encouraging economic opportunity for people in that zip code. That's where $20-30 million is actually going to objectively, pragmatically have the biggest impact. Poor neighborhoods in PG, poor neighborhoods in Western Maryland, poor neighborhoods in the Eastern Shore, and poor neighborhoods in Baltimore City and County. So just pragmatically speaking, that's where these funds are going to have the biggest net impact, is when you put them in the neighborhoods that typically do not get investment. And we as a state could reap that benefits of that investment for years to come if we do it now, or we can just not invest in these neighborhoods, leave them with nothing, legalize weed, make all the people that sell weed in these neighborhoods unemployed because they cannot compete with low-cost legal recreational weed, and then we're just replicating the cycle of violence. Right, so when you're talking to lawmakers, this is the framework that I'm coming from. This is the framework that I'm pitching to people. This is the framework that we will present at our event that we're doing next Saturday at the Living Well downtown, where we're going to have this conversation with more people from the community. And this is the animating impulse behind why I'm doing this advocacy. I had a call with the people from Normal, the big marijuana advocacy group, yesterday. And one of the things where I just told him I was being real was like, look, for you, marijuana legalization is the end in itself. For me, marijuana legalization is a means to an end of community empowerment and community self-determination. And I think if we're preaching that message, we can expand the people who are interested in this issue far beyond the people that consume marijuana and the people that want to sell marijuana, and see it as a social justice issue that everyone should be engaged in. Okay, so a little bit over time, but thank you for hanging in there. That's all I have. I just wanted to leave as much time for Q&A as possible.
So thank you very much, Lawrence. I appreciate that. And there's a lot there. I will definitely, we will unpack more of it through the conversation. And I think the video will be up too, so people can see who weren't able to be here. I want to open it up. If you have questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and just ask. Otherwise, I have a few. So
I have a few questions.
Sure.
Well, first off, can you explain why it's so expensive? Why does it take $2 to $3 million to set up?
The compliance cost in terms of tracking, in terms of lawyers, in terms of just everything's expensive for this stuff. Like, you need to be able to track the marijuana plant from the grower, from the nursery, to when it's sold to the consumer. So that's like expensive GPS-enabled tracking software. You need to basically subcontract to people that have already sold legal weed in Michigan, in Colorado, in Washington, to be able to even get compliant to most state laws. So it's this really messed up catch-22, where in order to sell legal weed, you got to go to somebody that already has sold legal weed, and that's disproportionately rich white people, right? You got to think about security. You got to have like real serious security, because this is still largely a cash business, because many of these banks are not processing credit card transactions for recreational marijuana especially. So you have thousands of dollars in cash on you at any given time. You have to have a safe, a big, strong safe. You have to have a security plan that you submit to the authorities. You got to basically pay a lobbyist if you want to get a license. And then if you have $2 to $3 million, you have to remember the grower, they need about $20 million. And they are the people that are the plug. They're making the real money. So you're basically getting hammered by your grower because they have a monopoly on the product. You can't go to Mexico. You can't even go to Pennsylvania to get weed because it's interstate commerce. That's a no-no because it's illegal federally. All the weed's got to come from the state in which it's been legalized in. So they have a monopoly and they know it. And they will give preferential prices to their friends, and they will not give those preferential prices to people who are not their friends. So you can have that 2 to 3 million. What I heard, this really blew my mind. What I heard is that people look at your 2 to 3 million and say, that's cute. Like, that's cute. I have 500 million behind me, and I will just wait until you have a bad quarter, and I'll just buy you out, right? So that is the unfortunate cutthroat reality of being in the marijuana dispensary business. It is a tough, tough game. So that's why I'm looking at the ancillary industries around the recreational trade. So I'm looking at specific niches within the trade where we can incentivize minority entrepreneurship. I think edibles is a really good space for that. I think that's naturally what a lot of folks are. So what can we put into the bill to incentivize craft cottage industry edibles having a particularly protected space in the market and tax subsidies that favor them? Security companies, like Black-owned, Black-run security companies, Black-owned, Black-run transport companies, Black-owned, Black-run delivery companies. These are all decent economic opportunities that are available, but the dispensary game is a hard, hard game to play. I think that we should study the people who are playing it well. I'm just telling people as real, I'm coming to this somewhat objective, not a consumer. I came to this question because of my interest in community empowerment, and my objective evaluation of Black people running dispensaries is that it's hard as hell, right? People are gonna do it, people are gonna make money, but even in its best case scenario, we have a few Black millionaires that probably don't live in the neighborhoods that's most impacted by the war on drugs. So that is not my focus. I'm building and working with other people where that is their focus. Now I want to support them, but I don't see myself as leading on that issue. And part of what I see myself as doing is expanding the frame that people use to evaluate that question. Because again, reparation is more than a few people selling weed legally. It's a community ecosystem that's being invested in and restored.
Thank you. If I could ask one more. We just interviewed a woman who's a co-author of a report that came out of the Institute for Policy Studies on the racial wealth divide, Sabrina Terry. I don't know if you know her. And Terry, Terry.
Okay.
And she, in that report, they talk about a concept of a racial wealth audit. And it's similar to, if you're putting in a project and you need an environmental impact statement.
Yeah.
A racial wealth impact statement of public policy. Is that something you're familiar with and something that maybe could start to be introduced? Because I noticed you kept race out of it, and I'm curious about why that was done. And
part of it is just understanding that politicians are very skittish about using the phrase reparations. I think we should call it reparations. We've committed to doing that. So once you call it reparations, race is in it. When I put race out of it, what I'm trying to do is make sure this bill passes legal constitutional muster, because I know, especially with Bobby Zirkin, that's going to be the trap that he tries to lay for this bill. I'm not going to make it personal because it's being recorded. I understand the school of thought he comes from, which is you people are cute, but you haven't thought through this from an intense legal perspective. And what people like him are going to say is that you cannot say only Black people get money from this fund. Therefore, this is dead on arrival. So that's why I have constructed the conversation around the actual implementation of this bill in a way that at every level, the way in which this fund would function should be constitutional. But the impact of using the evaluative metrics I laid out is specifically looking at the disproportionate historical impact of the war on drugs on Black and brown people. So what I'm trying to do is kind of skate to where the puck is going and basically say, like, look, when you use the word reparations, people are going to get scared, people are going to get frightened, people are going to say it's impossible, people are going to say it's unconstitutional and illegal. So at every level, but also people are going to get enthused, people are going to get hyped, people are going to get activated, and people are going to get interested when you use that framing. So I'm trying to get the best of the latter of all the positives of reparations, while accounting for the perceived and real detriments of using reparations as a framework. So that's why I talk about it that way. I do believe a racial wealth, some people call it a, like you said, a racial impact statement, a racial equity impact statement. And I do think that if you did a racial equity impact statement on recreational marijuana, you would see that there's some serious problems with it, just as it is. Because you are sucking money out of these middle-class Black neighborhoods, middle-class Black folk who are going to go to a recreational dispensary because they have the money to afford it. And that's going to have a real impact on poor Black folk who are going to keep going to their weed man, and their weed man is still going to be illegal. But he or she is going to be illegal because they're competing with the state of Maryland. So now they are an unlicensed, unregistered distributor. They're like people selling, cigarettes, bootleg cigarettes from North Carolina. So they're still going to be illegal, and you're still going to be arresting them, and you're still going to have that be a problem, but you're also going to have rich white people selling weed to middle class and rich white people, sucking that money out of the community. So I think without an explicit focus on redistribution of that tax revenue, there is a racial wealth, racial equity problem with legalized marijuana. And I think that some of our Black lawmakers have saw that. And they say, I don't know how I feel about legalization. And the impulse can be to jump on them and basically say, you're not woke, you're a conservative. But what they're really saying is like, they're saying the same things that many of us are saying. They just don't have the language to express it, usually in a very clean, nuanced way. So I think that it's important for us to work with folks where they are, but to be uncompromising about what the impact of what this bill would be. This bill would be explicitly targeting neighborhoods that have been impacted by the war on drugs. You don't have to say the word Black or brown when you say that. Like, racism has done the work for you in terms of using that as an evaluative metric of how this fund would operate.
Kevin, can I go? Or so I love the presentation, love the idea. I'm really glad I see someone working on this aspect of putting in place a way to correct the damage or somewhat fix the damage from the war on marijuana and war on drugs. So I'm glad you're doing it. I assume that the study or report you wrote is up on Leadership for Beautiful Studies. So, okay. Mm-hmm. So two questions. One on the dollar amount of tax revenue. Colorado has a population a little bit smaller than us.
Yep.
And they bring in $200 million a year.
Yep.
In tax revenue. Why do you see us as like half?
Well, I'm not saying half. I'm saying there's a range. I'm saying the range is from 75 to 150 million. When I look at Colorado, they have a ton of tourism. They get a ton of money that slides into that coffers through that. They have a tax arrangement, which is about middle of the pack, but what's in the bill right now for Maryland is lower than Colorado's, right? I think that Colorado, the reality is the demographics of high level marijuana users. I don't have direct knowledge of this. My guess is that they have self-selected in terms of moving themselves to Colorado. And those are the people who drive a huge chunk of the marijuana sales. It's older, experienced smokers who've built up a tolerance, who are willing to pay a premium for high THC weed that is to their liking. I am not sure Maryland has such a dense concentration of those people. Now, I can't prove that. I think that that's just a rational assumption. So I'm not saying that it's impossible for Maryland to get above $150 million in tax revenue. I tend to be more conservative in terms of projecting to what in my true best guesstimate, is true, we could do more than $150 million. I'm just trying to make sure that folks don't think this is a bonanza and a trough. They can just bring up that project and eat at it, right? Because that is the impulse of a lot of folks in Maryland. In Maryland, access to state grants is a huge political chip that lawmakers love to dole out, right? And so I think that being realistic and telling lawmakers that, look, this is not a free lunch, and we will not accept you treating this like a free lunch for your favorite pet project. There needs to be rules and order and a structure to who is getting this money. And the other thing I think is really powerful about the framing of it that I presented is that I'm not claiming that 100% of the tax money should go into this fund.
Okay.
Right now, the bill says 20%. I think that's a little bit low. What we typically say is 50%. But part of the reason we say 50% is that's a strong bargaining position.
Right.
So I think that we understand there's a lot of stuff people want to invest in. I'm not saying the entirety of the $150 million should go into a community restoration fund, but it darn sure should be enough to have a real impact, especially if you're splitting that a bunch of different ways, right? So like I said, the bill that Senator Smith has in, we've talked with Senator Smith a little bit, it's some language is in the bill at 20%, which I think is a huge step forward. Mm-hmm. I think that we should be very cognizant of enforcement, and I'm not satisfied with 20%. I'm going to advocate as vigorously as possible for as much money as possible because, again, I feel pretty confident in my ability to say that in terms of bang for your buck, in terms of trading off with other social services investments the state will have to make, in terms of like incarcerating people in the future, you can't make a better, stronger economic case than I think for investing in some of these most impacted neighborhoods. Now, I'm actually working to try to get funded to do some of that statistical analysis to show that if you spend a couple of bucks up front in these neighborhoods now, you're probably saving many, many times that down the road in terms of social services, incarceration, and all the other stuff you got to pay for. But I'm trying to build the infrastructure to do that work, to show that case in terms of facts, while also knowing that facts do not always rule the day. It's organizing this community understanding about why this is an important justice issue, which is why we use the word community restoration and reparations. So I think the number is, I'm not a statistician, I just call it how I see it. And I think 75 to 150 million, because again, Colorado is a mature industry right now. Maryland is going to grow into maturity over a few years. So when Maryland is mature, maybe that number will be over 150 million, but that may take 5-6 years. Right. So we're trying to project to where we are likely to grow from 50 million to 75 to 100 to 125. I think that's really possible. But what if we have an economic downturn? What if Pennsylvania legalizes? What if New Jersey legalizes? And that kind of, what if New Jersey has really strong tourism for recreational marijuana that sucks some of our money away? Like, that's all real possibilities. So I'm just trying to account for that.
I think that all makes a lot of sense. I imagine their 20% is also a bargaining position because they know they're getting pushed. So everyone's, so they may expect to go up a little bit. So I think that's the game being played. Have you considered the possibility of community participatory budgeting, which is a process of communities getting together, putting forward what their community needs, having groups in the community look at the various proposals, analyzing them, and then recommending to the community, and the community actually votes and decides where that money goes. It's working in a lot of places, and it could be a model that could really, I think, work real well for this kind of. And also nice about it is it brings the community together. You get the community all thinking about what can we do to make our community better, and there's a lot of really interesting writing about that. We've done a lot of studying on it. I just wonder if that's something you're considering.
Well, I would consider the youth fund a modified version of that. And I think the modifications are very intentional because before we came in, we did not choose to do the youth fund. We're not a nonprofit. We have the flexibility of hopping onto issues as we see opportunity and necessity. Some people told us they were concerned after Jack Young's youth fund proposal went through, which of course it was going to go through. They said, look, the people they're putting at the table, I don't know if they have the best ideas. So we went to the table. The table was led by a large established nonprofit in Baltimore, and they brought in people from Massachusetts. The people from Massachusetts were saying they had essentially a playbook for participatory budgeting. When we looked at their playbook and we talked to people in Massachusetts, we heard a lot of negative things about the way they did quote unquote participatory budgeting. What they essentially did was basically create the nonprofit Hunger Games, where you took different community proposals, you put the vote up to the community, especially an online vote, and that was used as a mechanism to delineate the money. And what we heard is that it actually drove apart community because they were competing for votes from different people in community, and it replicated the tendency of large nonprofits to have an institutional advantage in the quote-unquote participatory process. Because think about it, if you have a big PR budget, you can do a flashy video, you can pay for Facebook ads, you can pay for Instagram ads. And what people were saying, it's like it wasn't a fair fight. That you were basically replicating a lot of the worst dynamics of the nonprofit industrial complex in participatory budgeting. So that's when we stepped in. And that's why we proposed, thank you for coming, but we don't think your model from Massachusetts is really appropriate for Baltimore. And that did not go over very well. But we stood by our decision because we had done the research and we had talked to people about the methodology they were using, not truly reflecting us to the cooperative communal vision of participatory budgeting. It was a very linear, simplistic, technophilic vision of participatory budgeting that just did not accomplish what we felt was the set objective. So when we came in, part of the issue with the youth fund is that it wasn't geographically based. Now, this fund might be a little bit because the goal would be to isolate particular neighborhoods.
Right.
Ben Jealous called this micro zip code targeting, which I think is a useful conceptual framework. I still don't know what exactly it means, but I think it is a useful conceptual framework because it jives with what our friend Todd Clear told us about how incarceration functions. You have particular neighborhoods like Sandtown, Winchester, that have been targeted for decades of hyper-incarceration. And you have statistical evidence that shows what these neighborhoods are. They call them sometimes $1 million blocks because you can actually see that the state is spending millions of dollars incarcerating the people just from this one block or zip code. So I think I want to know what those people think, but I know that most participatory budgeting frameworks will not truly go to them.
Right.
They will have the people from the community associations. They will have the people from the office of the city councilman. They will have the people from the big nonprofits. They'll have the people from the churches, but they won't have the family members of the people who actually live in these zip codes. So I think we need to have a much deeper, much, more rich understanding of participatory budgeting, which is hard because when you do the work, it's sometimes hard to tell the story of the work. Like Bee City, we basically took a lot of people who are grassroots community advocates and put them in a position to make funding decisions about who got funded. But they didn't write up Bee City in the Baltimore Sun, so you wouldn't even know that existed.
Right.
So we have experience doing this. We have experience seeing what works and what doesn't. The hard part is knowing that we don't live in PG County. We don't live in Baltimore County. We're not everywhere, and we don't even have Baltimore City on lock the way we should. It's going to be hard for any of these processes to fulfill their maximum potential. So what I'm trying to do right now, knowing that it's imperfect, is to, again, create a process that you cannot control from the top down. That's the hard part, and that's what politicians are terrified of. They're terrified of a process they cannot control. Yep. And it's very hard to build a process they cannot control because their entire raison d'etre is control. So that's where I think the work has to come in. And I think that it's harder than you think, building a participatory budgeting process that cannot be co-opted and controlled, but that's where the work is.
Great, thank you. Good points.
I have some data questions and some policy questions.
Okay.
Let me start with the data questions. Do you have a list of the zip codes throughout the state of Maryland that would be like, do you have your list basically of all of them?
No, I think that's one of those things where you have to triage and sort of focus on where you have capacity. So right now, I'm working on aggregating the data on the taxation and funding regimes from all the states around the country. So I'm actually working with the Baltimore Action Legal team to do some research that aggregates as much data as we can find on the taxation and the taxation regimes around the country and what that money goes towards. So that's where I've kind of put my energy, because I know that once I need to get those zip codes, they're probably going to stand out like sore thumbs. Like, we probably know what they are. It's just a matter of getting the data. The ACLU has begun to do that work, but their data is at a countywide and citywide level. So you can see the disparity in PG in Baltimore City is like bigger than the disparity in Howard County. So you begin to see the contours of how that funding regime might look, especially when you account for population, right? So like some of that stuff is there, but part of also the reality is it's up to the locality to make the decision about how they're going to implement this fund, at least the way that we've conceived it. So we know that when this fund comes down, if it is what we say it is, we have to focus on Baltimore City. But that would leave Baltimore County, PG, and other localities. Local activists there would have to pick up the baton, and they would have to push their localities to do this fund right. And that's something that is, again, a hard reality that we have to face. Is I can't force proper enforcement of this fund on anybody, right? So all I can do is present the framework, give people in PG, Baltimore County, and Howard County an opportunity to rise up at a grassroots level, give them a mandate from the state about what this fund should do, but it's up to the people on the ground to implement it. And all I can really do is do the best implementation role at a state level to give the localities a shot, and then focus on Baltimore City and give help to anyone else that I can. So I'm sure that the people in PG know what zip codes they would have to go to. I know that for a fact, right? So that's why I'm more focused on getting it right at the state level, so that those folks have a shot to get it right at a local level.
Okay, great, thank you. And the second question is, I heard you mentioning that Baltimore City should pass an ordinance about how the city funds it. So what is the sequence on it? Does the state have to pass their bill first, and then the city decides how they fund it? Or could, like, in 2020,
well, yeah. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
In 2020, could there be a ballot initiative that goes along with the state, a city ballot initiative that goes along with the state ballot initiative that allocates the funding source type of thing?
Okay, well, that's a good question. In my mind, Baltimore City would not have to fund it. Baltimore City would have to designate who they want to control the money. So that would have to be, again, an accountability touch point where people like you and I could go to the city council and be like, I don't know if I want the Family League to have this money. Or the Family League is fine with this money, but I want some strict, objective accountability metrics to the Family League. Or I don't like the Family League, I want somebody else, right? So that's what the locality would have to designate. They would have to designate the entity that controlled the funds. They could, if they wanted, make a supplementary local contribution to the fund. I think that makes perfect sense, but that's not currently what I've planned out for this fund. So the order of operation would be, the bill has to pass in Annapolis. If the bill on marijuana legalization includes putting it on the ballot for a constitutional amendment, the constitutional amendment has to pass. Once the constitutional amendment passes, it's then going essentially back to Annapolis to figure out what the actual implementation strategy for the bill is. Because, you know, they're not going to put a 50-page ballot, a 50-page bill on the ballot. You could do that, but places that have done that, it's been a catastrophe in terms of logistics. So whatever they're going to put on the ballot is going to be relatively vague in terms of language, and it's going to be up to us as advocates to go to Annapolis to pound them on the equitable enforcement of whatever gets put on the ballot. And then after they set the regulatory infrastructure in Annapolis, and after they start selling weed for a year, then the money gets kicked out to the locality. And then the locality, which has already designated who's going to hold the funds, is then in theory going to set up the fund. Now, one thing that is important that I'm now just thinking of because of your question is it may make sense to, like a year before the money comes in, have the locality, in our case Baltimore City or Baltimore County, I imagine, designate funding available to set up whatever infrastructure is necessary to handle this money. Because that's one of the things that was hard with the U Fund, is there was a limited ability to have prior access to the funds. So we had to really struggle on the back end to build the infrastructure to build it on thing. So it would be a good idea to have the city pay for the administrative infrastructure to either build a new entity, to build accountability into an existing entity to handle this money. So that would be something you would want to have be a monetary expenditure from the locality. But they would not have to fund it unless they wanted to. They probably should, but that's a separate question.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Early on, you were talking about how the hurdles cost-wise for many people, whether consumers or entrepreneurs, are a product of the sort of capitalist, monopolistic situation we have. Is there any hope of addressing that monopoly situation, the licensing regime, making it somewhere, breaking it up so that the small-time producers have a shot?
Yeah, I think so. I would advise you to come to the event that LBS is co-sponsoring, not this Saturday, but next Saturday. We're going to have people from Massachusetts. Massachusetts has not only a fledgling recreational sector, but they have some of the best laws around equity and small business empowerment of all the states that have done this. So we're going to bring those folks down, and we're going to have folks from Maryland try to do a bit of a deeper dive on some of these issues. And so, again, I think that there's encouraging things happening from a legal perspective in Massachusetts, in California, but what they have found is even doing, marijuana co-ops, even doing preferential access for people who have previous criminal records, those folks still have to raise the capital and run a business. The analogy I give is you could have the best playground street basketball player on the planet. Putting them in the NBA is not going to be as effective because it's an entirely different game. That's part of what I'm seeing with folks transitioning from the street economy to recreational marijuana in the above ground economy. It's just an entirely different game. And it doesn't mean you can't play. It's a different set of rules, right? And so it's very, very difficult because, again, I hear what to them are success stories, but to me are almost horror stories of just like, rich white guys who they sold it illegally for years. And they just went into the legal side and they had great success because they just had so much connections and they had so much experience and they had the privilege of essentially not being the targets of hyper enforcement. So you have small scale producers who can get access, but you need, and what I've seen at least, is really, really great luck or really, really great privilege to have access to that success. Now, like I said, you can write the bill in a way that encourages, again, to me, I think we got to stop being creative. I'm looking at things like, they call it the cottage industry, which is basically a separate legal provision for small-scale marijuana producers to have access to legal marijuana entrepreneurship without as much regulatory hurdles. It's like, you have Chips Ahoy, but you also have, the cookies your mom sells at the farmer's market. It's like, it shouldn't be illegal for her to sell those cookies just because Chips Ahoy exists. Just because you have these $25 million grow operations doesn't mean you shouldn't have the possibility of small-scale producers having the ability to sell, especially if you have home grow. Home grow is just what it sounds like, the ability for individuals who choose to be able to grow a certain number of plants. And if you have home grow, well, how about you be able to sell your access? What you can't smoke, you should be able to gift or sell. And that's the beginnings of a cottage industry regulatory framework that basically says, hey, you can grow a certain number of plants at home, and if you don't want to smoke it, then hey, you can sell it. But having that be like cool is one thing. Having that be a money-making industry is another thing. And we have to learn and grow with the examples we're getting from other states about what to do and what not to do. Like DC has this really burgeoning gifting economy. Like you can't sell weed in DC, but you can buy a $50 t-shirt and they can give you an eighth with it as a gift, right? And that sounds cool. In some ways it is, but you're also seeing there's zero regulatory predictability in DC. There's zero ability to get upfront capital in DC. So you have what looks and sounds really cool, but in reality, it's like a nightmare for small scale entrepreneurs who aren't like the affluent, privileged white stoner class. So we just have a lot of examples of what not to do, and we don't have a ton of examples of what to do. when it comes to developing sustainable small-scale entrepreneurs. Now, we have a huge benefit is that marijuana is still illegal at a federal level. So it makes it very hard for nationwide marijuana conglomerates to easily dominate these markets. They are still doing it, but it's way less efficient for them. They have to go state by state by state. And it's been an industry that is not as susceptible to massive out-of-state transnational capital. And as long as marijuana is still legal at a federal level, you have the ability for these people at a state level to rise up and find a niche in the economy. So I think it's possible. I think it's going to happen at an underground level, even while it becomes legal. And I think that there's great consumer loyalty to certain brands, to certain people they have relationships with. Can you build upon that loyalty and build upon that brand equity that gets built up amongst these communities in the legal marijuana space? Part of the problem is just we as a country suck at incubating genuine small-scale entrepreneurship. Like, it's hard because what we know is how to produce employees for massive multinational conglomerates. Like, our workforce development is that. It is like free workforce training for rich companies. So what we call workforce development in the state isn't conducive necessarily to this, but that doesn't mean if we were able to rethink what is business incubation or workforce development, we couldn't do what you're talking about. But it requires really, again, commitment on the people who are pushing for this to happen, because you got to invest in this. It has to be an investment by the state to say we want to have small-scale entrepreneurship, but that's the state investing in the competition for the people that give these people campaign donations, right? So you're just in a very, very difficult place where you have to build the business incubation infrastructure, probably from public money, maybe from some nonprofit money, but you have to build a real infrastructure for it. And the question is, how do you extract that money from a public sector who is beholden to the people that give them campaign donations, which is a small sliver of very, very rich, prospective local marijuana barons. So it's not easy, but I do think there is opportunity.
Teresa, any questions?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on tonight, Lawrence, and leading us through this discussion. I think there's a whole lot to unpack here, and I really look forward to having the conversation again within the Green Party about how we orient ourselves toward the topic of legal marijuana as it's going to come up in the next year. And I think you've given us a whole lot to think about tonight, and I appreciate you kicking off our 2019 policy and webinar series. I will go ahead and record this, or I have it recorded. I'll go ahead and get it posted. I'll make sure I send you a copy of it. And there's links in the chat for anybody who's on here to Lawrence's article, policy piece really that's written on this, plus a link to the 2 excerpts I found from the Green Party of the U.S. platform that I think really speak to this. They're the part on ending the war on drugs and the part on the philosophical commitment of the party to reparations as something that we believe is part of economic and racial justice. So thank you all very much tonight. I appreciate the opportunity.
Can I say one thing real quick, Andy?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so as folks who may have been on the call heard, we are having an event. LBS is co-sponsoring the event with We Bake, which is a Black-run nonprofit out of PG. We're doing an event in Baltimore on March the 2nd from 3 to 6 at the Living Well. That is basically us trying to bring folks in the community together to address exactly the concerns that you all are having about how do we have cooperative business in the sector? How do we have racial justice? How do we look at what other states are doing well and make sure we get the best parts of that here in Maryland, and we avoid what states are doing poorly, and we actually have the best bill possible in Maryland. So again, that's 3 to 6, March 2nd, Saturday, at the Living Well, 235 Holiday Street. Again, we're bringing folks down from the Massachusetts recreational Coalition, and they do really, really great work advocating in Massachusetts on these issues. And so we would just love for folks to come out to that event.
Well,
Is that event legal cannabis in our community? Is that what it is?
Yep, that's the event.
Okay, let me find it and I'll share it in the.
Okay, I think I shared the event with you. I'm going to be speaking there in addition to the folks in Massachusetts, in addition to other folks that we've been working and building with. Like I said, we're trying to build a EarthSats informal coalition, especially of folks who really want to focus on the business side, because I know I don't have the capacity to do that lift alone. So I really want to focus on the tax revenue at LDS, but we need to build a coalition of folks pushing on all three of those legs of the stool, and that's what we're going to start doing at that event.
So we're going to be out of the country then, but if you have other events, please let us know.
Yeah, we'll probably have another one probably in April, closer to 420, but that might be in PG. So we're just trying to figure out what we can do to spread the word and begin to really push the advocacy forward.
Do you have, can you by any chance share the link in the chat?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I'm sort of not on Facebook this week, so
I gotcha.
So I don't know. So, okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody for joining tonight. I look forward to the event, and I look forward to getting the recording shared. Thank you so much, Lawrence. It was great to get to have the opportunity to go over this with you. Thank you to everybody who was on the call.
yeah, thank you very much. It was really great.
Yeah, really,
Yeah.
thank you. Very informative.
If folks have any questions, you can just email me at lawrence@lbsbaltimore.com.
Great. Very good.
And I put the event link in the chat, and I will be sharing it via our LBS social media probably this weekend, next week.
Great.
All right, yeah.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot. Appreciate
No
it.
problem.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice night.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Cool. I'm ready to endorse.